there she was.
It's time.
Nadia, my landlady, was standing near the staircase, just outside the door to my apartment. I hadn't expected to see her, and I certainly hadn't expected her to be waiting there. She had always been the kind of woman who kept to herself, never one to make small talk or intrude on anyone's privacy. In all the months I'd lived here, our interactions had been polite, brief, and businesslike. I paid my rent, and she managed the building. That was the extent of it. But tonight, there was something different. As I approached, she didn't simply nod or give her usual courteous smile. Instead, she stood there, almost as if she had been waiting for me. Her long black hair was loosely tied back, a few strands escaping to frame her face in a way that made her look both effortless and elegant. Her eyes, dark and deep, were filled with something more than just the routine tenant-landlady exchange. I couldn't place it, but there was an undeniable softness to her gaze. "Hey," she said, her voice unexpectedly gentle. Her words seemed to linger in the air as if she were choosing them carefully, as though there was something more that she wanted to say but didn't know how to express. I stopped a few feet away from her, slightly taken aback by her presence. "Hi, Nadia. Is everything all right?" I asked, the words coming out more out of routine than genuine concern. But the moment I saw her face, I realized this was no typical interaction. I wanted to ask you something," she replied, her voice quieter now, her eyes flickering with a mix of hesitation and uncertainty. There was something in her manner that made me pause, something that felt different from the usual small exchanges we had. I raised an eyebrow, curious but cautious. "Sure, what's up?" And then, as if she had been carefully rehearsing these words in her mind, she said something I didn't expect, something that caught me off guard. "I was thinking, maybe you should stay tonight. If you're not busy, of course." Her words, simple as they were, hit me harder than I anticipated. There was no obvious reason for her to ask. It wasn't like we were friends, and we had certainly never shared anything more than a polite hello and goodbye. But there was a weight in her voice, a soft vulnerability I hadn't noticed before. I looked at her, unsure of how to respond. "Stay, tonight?" "Yes," she said, her eyes meeting mine with a surprising intensity. "I just thought maybe you wouldn't mind. It's been a long day, and, well, I could use the company. If it's not too much trouble." I felt an unexpected flutter in my chest. There was something in the way she spoke, something unspoken that passed between us, something that wasn't just about being a good neighbor or tenant anymore. It felt almost like an invitation, but the kind that came with hesitation, a silent question in her eyes. Her words hung in the air as if waiting for me to answer, but I couldn't quite process what had just happened. What did this mean? Did she want me to stay for conversation, or was there something else? I nodded slowly, still trying to understand her intent. "Sure, I can stay for a bit." And just like that, something shifted. I wasn't sure if I was crossing some invisible line, or if this was simply the start of something I had never anticipated. But as I followed her inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would change everything between us. As I stepped inside Nadia's apartment, the shift in the air around us was undeniable. The living room was modest, filled with simple, yet elegant furnishings, a few comfortable chairs, a soft rug, and shelves neatly lined with books. The walls were adorned with soft, warm tones, and a small vase of fresh flowers rested on the coffee table. It was inviting, peaceful, almost therapeutic, and yet, the energy between us crackled with something that couldn't be ignored. Nadia gestured for me to sit on the couch, and as I did, I felt an odd sense of intimacy in the way she moved around the room. There was no rush in her steps, no pretense. She was simply herself, and that openness, combined with her quiet beauty, was disarming. She looked at me, her expression soft, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "So, what's been going on with you lately?" she asked, her voice low and warm. The question seemed so ordinary, but it carried a weight that made me pause before answering. She was genuinely interested in me, in my life, and that was rare enough to make my heart skip a beat. I hesitated at first, unsure of what to say. I had never really opened up to anyone about my struggles or my thoughts. people didn't ask. Nadia, however, didn't rush me. She simply sat across from me, her posture relaxed but attentive, as if she was willing to let me take my time. There was a quiet understanding in the way she looked at me, something that made me feel like she had seen things in life that I hadn't, things that had taught her patience. "I've just been trying to figure things out, you know?" I said, my voice a little rough. "Work's been stressful, and I don't know. I guess I've been going through a bit of a rut." She nodded, her dark brown eyes watching me with that same steady focus. "I understand," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "Sometimes life has a way of pulling us in different directions. We just don't realize how much it's weighing on us until we stop." Her words hit me harder than I expected. There was something in them, something personal, something real. I looked at her, noticing the slight smile lines around her eyes, the quiet grace in the way she sat, and I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of empathy toward her. I realized that, in some ways, we were both carrying burdens, though they were different. Nadia's gaze didn't waver, her eyes soft but filled with an intensity that made me feel like she was truly seeing me, in a way no one ever had. It was unnerving, but in the best way possible. The space between us, though still distant in a physical sense, had started to shrink. "I guess I've been feeling a little stuck," I admitted, my voice quieter now. "Like I'm just going through the motions, but not really living. I've been trying to figure out what comes next, but I don't know if I even have a clear idea anymore." Nadia's lips curled into a gentle smile, and she leaned forward slightly, her posture soft but strong. "It's okay to not have everything figured out," she said. "Sometimes the most important step is simply acknowledging where you are. Then, little by little, things start to shift." Her words were comforting, but it wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way she said them. The sincerity in her voice, the quiet wisdom that seemed to emanate from her, made me feel like I was talking to someone who understood what it was like to face doubt, confusion, and the loneliness that often accompanied it. There was something deeply reassuring in the way she shared her space with me, in the way she allowed the conversation to unfold naturally, without pushing, without forcing. As we continued to talk, the conversation moved from surface-level exchanges to more personal topics. She spoke of her own experiences, her life as a woman balancing work, responsibilities, and the emotional weight that came with them. I could hear the unspoken truths in her words, the parts of herself that she kept hidden from others. I could feel the connection between us growing, like an invisible thread weaving through our conversation. Every word, every glance, seemed to pull us closer, without either of us needing to say a word about it. The warmth in the room, the way the soft light from the table lamp highlighted the features of her face, created an atmosphere of quiet intimacy. I wasn't sure if it was the comfortable silence between us or the deeper emotional connection that was beginning to form, but there was a sense of something unspoken hanging in the air. It felt like we were both aware of it, yet neither of us knew how to address it. The tension was subtle, fragile, even, but it was undeniably there. We both knew that something had shifted. I could feel it in the way our glances lingered, in the way our words held weight, and in the way the quiet moments between us no longer felt awkward. There was a new understanding, a shared space where we could simply be ourselves without the need for pretense. It wasn't just the physical space between us that had changed, it was the emotional space. And in that moment, as I looked at Nadia, I realized that tonight wasn't just about staying over for a simple conversation. Tonight was about something deeper, something we were both just beginning to explore. The clock on the wall ticked away quietly as the conversation between us flowed, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere that neither of us acknowledged at first. As the night deepened, the soft hum of the world outside seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of our voices and the occasional clink of the teacup as we both sipped from our mugs. Nadia had always struck me as someone who exuded quiet confidence. She was composed, poised in a way that made her seem untouchable, a woman in complete control of her life. But tonight, she wasn't the same. She was still graceful, of course, but there was something different. A hint of uncertainty lingered in the way her eyes occasionally flickered to the floor, a softness in her voice that wasn't there before. As I spoke, she listened, her focus entirely on me, her dark eyes studying me with a depth that made me feel seen, truly seen, in a way that made my heart beat just a little faster. But when I paused for a moment to take a breath, the silence between us felt charged, pregnant with something unspoken. That's when she spoke again. "I don't usually talk about myself," Nadia said, her voice a little quieter now. "I guess I've always kept people at arm's length. It's easier that way, you know." I looked at her, surprised by the sudden shift in her tone. She was admitting something to me, something vulnerable. It was so unlike her, so raw, that it caused me to pause. Her expression softened, and I could see the vulnerability behind her calm, controlled demeanor. She was letting me into a part of her that few people ever got to see. "I've been on my own for a while," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "And sometimes I wonder if I've made the right choices. If I've pushed too many people away." The admission hung in the air like a heavy, fragile thing. I felt a knot form in my chest. There was something incredibly personal in her words, something I had never expected from her. Nadia, the strong, confident woman who managed everything with ease, was revealing the quiet battles she fought in her own heart. I couldn't help but feel a deep empathy for her, something I hadn't anticipated. In that moment, I understood that beneath the surface, there was more to her than what I had seen before. She wasn't just my landlady, the woman who ran the building with efficient grace. She was a person who had experienced her own share of struggles, her own doubts and fears. And for reasons I couldn't fully comprehend, she had chosen to share a piece of that with me. Her gaze was fixed on her hands now, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her teacup. I could sense the hesitation in her, as if she wasn't sure whether she had shared too much, whether she had opened up too quickly. But the vulnerability in her eyes was undeniable, and I felt a quiet pull to reach out, to somehow offer comfort in the only way I knew how. "It's okay," I said, my voice soft, though my own words felt clumsy. "We all go through that kind of thing. It doesn't make you weak. It just means you're human." Nadia looked up at me then, her expression unreadable for a moment. But then, a small, grateful smile tugged at the corners of her lips, soft and tender. It was the first time I'd seen her smile like that, without any of the usual walls she kept up. There was something incredibly powerful in that simple gesture. It was an unspoken acknowledgement, a recognition of the trust she had placed in me. "I guess," she said, her voice still quiet but steady, "it's just that sometimes I forget that I don't always have to carry everything on my own." I nodded slowly, letting her words settle between us. There was a profound depth to them, a quiet invitation to be part of something more than just a fleeting interaction. Her honesty, her openness, it wasn't just about her past or her struggles. It was about her letting me into a space that had been locked away for so long. And in that moment, I realized that this conversation wasn't just a simple exchange between a tenant and a landlady. It was something deeper. We were sharing parts of ourselves with each other, parts that had long been hidden. I shifted in my seat, suddenly acutely aware of the quiet tension between us. The space that had once felt so comfortable now felt heavier, filled with unspoken words and emotions. The night had unfolded in a way neither of us expected, and there was an undeniable connection between us now, one that neither of us was fully prepared for but that neither of us could deny. It wasn't just about the words we shared, it was the unspoken understanding that seemed to linger in the room. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just talking to my landlady. I was talking to a woman who had fears and dreams and hopes, someone who needed to share, to be heard. And in that shared silence, that understanding, I knew that something had shifted. Something that couldn't be undone. As the evening wore on, the subtle tension between us began to evolve into something deeper, something more meaningful. The clock on the wall continued its rhythmic ticking, but the time felt like it had stretched, expanded in the space between us. We were no longer just two people passing through each other's lives in the most basic, transactional sense. In that room, under the soft glow of the lamp and the warmth of the lingering tea, something had changed. Nadia had gone from being my landlady to being something more, someone I was beginning to understand in a way I hadn't before. There was a quiet wisdom in her presence, a grace that went beyond the surface. I had always seen her as the woman who managed this building, someone I exchanged pleasantries with. But now, I saw her in a different light, someone with depth, with experiences that shaped who she was. And in return, I was slowly revealing parts of myself, too, pieces I had kept tucked away out of fear or habit. It wasn't until the conversation began to quiet, the natural rhythm between us faltering, that I realized just how much we had shared. Neither of us had expected this level of intimacy, this bond that seemed to form effortlessly. And yet, there we were, sitting a little closer than before, our legs almost touching beneath the coffee table. For a moment, there was nothing but the silence between us, a gentle, comfortable stillness that wasn't awkward but felt profound. It was the kind of quiet that made everything seem clearer, that made the weight of each unspoken thought feel almost tangible. I found myself glancing at her more often now, noticing the subtle details I hadn't paid attention to before. The way her hair fell around her shoulders, slightly tousled from earlier, framing her face in soft waves. The way her hands moved, graceful and purposeful, even as she set her cup down on the table. And most of all, I noticed the way she looked at me. It was as if she was seeing me for who I was, not just the tenant she rented to but the person beneath the surface. "I don't usually let people in like this," Nadia said after a long pause, her voice quiet but not uncertain. She wasn't looking at me directly, instead, she was looking at the empty teacup in her hands, as if gathering the words before letting them go. "I keep to myself most of the time. It's easier that way." Her confession hung in the air between us, soft yet heavy with meaning. I didn't speak right away. I simply listened, feeling the weight of her honesty. I didn't know if she meant to say it aloud, but she had, and it felt like a door had opened just slightly. There was an honesty in her words that was disarming, and I felt a deep desire to respond in kind. "You don't have to explain," I said, my voice soft. "I get it. Sometimes it's easier to keep things inside, not to let anyone too close." Her dark eyes met mine then, the vulnerability in them unmistakable. She didn't look away. Instead, she allowed the silence to settle between us, acknowledging something unspoken, something both of us understood. The quiet intimacy in the room was palpable, and for the first time, I realized that we weren't just sharing words anymore. We were sharing pieces of ourselves. Nadia shifted slightly in her seat, her body angling a little toward mine. It wasn't a sudden move but a small, natural shift, an unconscious effort to close the distance between us. And it wasn't lost on me. I could feel the change in the air, the shift in the unspoken dynamic between us. Her posture softened, and she leaned forward just a little, her eyes never leaving mine. It was as if she was asking me to acknowledge what was happening, to allow the space between us to exist without words. We had crossed a threshold, one that was both subtle and powerful. The emotional barrier that had once existed between us had begun to dissolve, and what was left in its place was an understanding, a mutual respect that had grown out of an unexpected conversation. I wasn't sure where this moment would lead, but I knew that something had changed in me. I had always kept my own walls up, always kept parts of myself hidden from others. But tonight, in her presence, I felt a warmth, a pull, that made me want to open up, to share not just my surface-level thoughts but the deeper things that I usually kept to myself. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to hide. Nadia's openness gave me the courage to do the same, and as I looked at her, I realized that she, too, was no longer holding back. The moments of vulnerability we shared had deepened the connection between us, making me feel both stronger and more fragile at the same time. The conversation continued, each word flowing more easily now, as if we were both no longer afraid to speak the truth, to show the parts of ourselves that we usually kept hidden. And in that exchange, something unspoken had begun to take shape, something that neither of us could ignore, even if we didn't yet fully understand it. The distance between us had closed, not just physically but emotionally, and in that shared moment, everything felt more real. More possible. The night had stretched on, and the air between us was now thick with an unspoken tension. Our conversation had shifted to more comfortable ground, shared interests, favorite books, memories of past travels, but the subtle undercurrent of something more hung in the space between us, barely noticeable yet undeniable. The way her eyes lingered on me when I spoke, the way I found myself drawn to her even when she wasn't speaking, it all added up to something that felt like it was waiting to unfold. As the clock ticked on, I realized I had been here longer than I initially intended. I stood up, ready to say my goodbyes, but something about the moment made me hesitate. I didn't want to leave just yet. There was something about her presence that kept me rooted to the spot, something about the connection between us that felt both fragile and vital at the same time. Nadia stood with me, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she, too, was reluctant to break the spell we had created. I watched as she walked toward the door, her figure graceful and calm, but her posture slightly tighter, more restrained. It was as if the moment of ease we had shared was beginning to slip away. When she reached the door, she paused, her back to me, hand resting on the doorknob. She didn't turn around immediately, and I couldn't quite place the emotion in the air. Was it sadness? Was it hesitation? It was something in between, a quiet uncertainty that had crept into her movements. She had offered me an invitation, one I hadn't expected, but now there was a shift, an invisible wall that had started to form again. I moved toward her, and as I got closer, I could feel my heart rate quicken. There was something about this moment that felt different, like something was about to happen that neither of us could prevent. I reached her just as she was about to open the door. "Thank you for staying," she said softly, her voice a quiet whisper, as though she hadn't meant for me to hear it. "I didn't want to be alone tonight." Her words caught me off guard. They were simple, but they carried a weight that made me pause. There was something vulnerable in her admission, something raw that made my chest tighten. She wasn't just being polite, she was revealing something deeper, something I hadn't expected. It was a side of her I hadn't seen before, the part of her that didn't always have it all together, that didn't have all the answers. Without thinking, I reached out, my hand brushing hers. The contact was light at first, barely a touch, but it felt like an electric jolt. My heart skipped, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. She didn't pull away, instead, she let her hand linger in mine for just a second longer than what was expected. It was a small gesture, almost innocent in its simplicity, but the moment it lasted was enough to send my pulse racing. Nadia's eyes met mine then, and for a split second, time seemed to stop. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, something unreadable, and I couldn't help but feel a wave of warmth wash over me. The room felt smaller now, and the air between us seemed charged, as if the space itself was holding its breath. She pulled her hand away gently, but there was no awkwardness in the movement. It was as if the touch had simply been a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding. Her gaze didn't waver, but there was a softness to it now, an openness that hadn't been there before. Her lips parted, as though she were about to say something, but then she closed them again, as if the words weren't quite ready to come out. I took a step back, feeling the weight of the moment settle between us. I could sense her hesitation, her uncertainty, but there was also something more, something deeper that I couldn't quite place. I didn't know what the lingering touch meant, or what it might lead to, but in that fleeting moment, everything between us felt more real than it had before. I wasn't just a tenant in her building anymore. I was someone who had seen her in a way that no one else had, someone who had shared a quiet, intimate space with her. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was a quiet understanding, a mutual recognition of the unspoken connection that had formed between us. Neither of us spoke, and neither of us moved. It was as if we were both waiting for something, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the courage to say or do something that would shift the balance of what had begun. In the end, it was Nadia who broke the silence, her voice gentle but steady. "I guess I should let you go. You've probably got a busy day tomorrow." I nodded, my throat tight, unsure of what to say. As I turned to leave, I felt the weight of the unspoken words still hanging between us. It was clear to me now that this wasn't just about a casual invitation, a simple conversation. Something had shifted, and the connection between us had deepened in a way that neither of us was fully ready to acknowledge. As I stepped into the hallway, I looked back at her one last time. Nadia stood there in the doorway, her figure silhouetted by the soft light behind her, her hand still resting lightly on the knob. Our eyes met for one brief moment, and I saw the flicker of something, a question, a longing, that lingered in her gaze. And just like that, I knew, tonight wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The days after that night seemed to stretch on in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Nadia's invitation, her vulnerability, the touch we had shared, it all lingered in my mind like a quiet whisper, constantly present but never fully understood. The warmth of her hand against mine, the softness of her eyes as she looked at me, those moments had shifted something inside me, and I couldn't ignore it. For the first time in a long while, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew. I had always been the kind of person to keep my emotions at arm's length, to shield myself from vulnerability. I wasn't the type to easily open up to people, but with Nadia, it felt different. She had somehow broken through that barrier, and now I was left grappling with the feelings she had awakened in me. It had been several days since that evening, and yet, every time I passed her apartment door, I felt a strange pull in my chest. I could sense her presence behind the walls, even though we hadn't spoken since that night. The silence between us had become a constant, a tension that I couldn't escape. But the silence was more than just the absence of words, it was a space where something unspoken simmered just below the surface. I had returned from work one evening, feeling tired and drained, when I found myself standing in front of her door once again. I wasn't sure what had brought me here, curiosity, perhaps, or something more. All I knew was that I needed to talk to her, to somehow break the silence between us. It wasn't just about the words anymore, it was about understanding what had happened between us, what it all meant. I knocked softly, the sound of my knuckles against the wood feeling louder than it should. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no movement. My heart rate quickened, and I began to second-guess myself. But then, the door opened, and there she was. Nadia. Her dark eyes met mine, and for a moment, I felt as though time had stopped. She looked just as beautiful as I remembered, her hair cascading around her shoulders, her face soft yet guarded. There was a flicker of something in her expression, surprise, perhaps, or maybe even apprehension. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Hey," I said, my voice coming out softer than I intended. I was hoping we could talk." She looked at me for a long moment, her gaze searching mine, as if trying to read the intent behind my words. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the hesitation that mirrored my own. She hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated that I would show up at her door, not after the way things had ended last time. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice gentle, though there was a hint of caution in it. "I wasn't expecting you." "I've been thinking," I said, stepping closer but not crossing the threshold. I didn't want to invade her space. I can't stop thinking about what happened the other night. About us. About what was between us." Nadia's expression softened slightly, but she didn't say anything immediately. She just stood there, looking at me, her lips pressed together as if weighing her next words carefully. The tension in the air was thick now, and I could feel the heaviness of the unspoken emotions between us. I knew that she felt it too, that strange pull that had drawn us together in a way neither of us had anticipated. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter now, almost as if she were confessing something she hadn't said aloud before. "I don't usually let people in like this," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "I've spent so many years keeping everything inside, keeping people at a distance. But with you, it's different. And I don't know what that means, or what to do with it." Her words struck me like a wave, knocking the breath out of me. There it was, the admission that I had been waiting for, the confession that had been lingering between us. Nadia was just as unsure as I was, just as vulnerable, even though she had always seemed so composed. She had built walls around herself, just like I had, but now, in this quiet moment, those walls were beginning to crumble. I stepped forward, closer to her now, unable to stop myself. "You don't have to know right now," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I need you to know that I'm here. Whatever happens next, I'm here." She looked at me, her eyes searching mine again, and for the first time, I saw the vulnerability she had hidden so well. Her lips parted slightly, as though she were about to say something, but no words came. Instead, she reached out, her hand trembling ever so slightly as it rested on my arm. The touch was soft, tentative, as if she were testing the waters, unsure of how far she could go. The gesture was enough. It was her way of telling me that she was willing to take a chance, to let the walls come down, just a little. "I don't know what this is," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "But I can't ignore it anymore." And in that moment, I realized that neither of us had been able to ignore it. The connection, the pull between us, was undeniable. We were standing on the edge of something neither of us had fully understood before, but both of us were willing to explore it, together. I didn't have all the answers. Neither did she. But in that fragile, quiet moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that we were willing to take the next step, whatever that might look like. The unspoken confession had been made, and neither of us was ready to let go of what had begun to blossom between us. The days that followed felt different, as if the air itself had shifted. Nadia and I had crossed a threshold, one neither of us had expected to reach. The conversation at her door had been a turning point, a moment where everything we had kept hidden, all the thoughts and feelings we had silently carried, were brought to the surface. It was as if an invisible line had been drawn between the old us, the strangers who merely exchanged pleasantries, and the new us, the ones who had shared something real, something deeper. I couldn't stop thinking about the touch of her hand on my arm, the way she had looked at me, vulnerable, open, yet cautious. It was a kind of silent agreement between us, a mutual understanding that things had changed, even if we hadn't fully acknowledged it. The connection was no longer just a quiet undercurrent, it had become a force we could both feel, undeniable and present in everything we did. For the first time, I found myself seeking out her company, not because I was a tenant who had to pay rent, but because I wanted to be near her. I hadn't planned for this, hadn't anticipated the way my heart had begun to race every time I saw her, but there was no denying it. There was something between us, something I couldn't ignore anymore. Nadia seemed to be feeling it too, though she wasn't as open about it as I was. She still kept her distance in some ways, still guarded. But there was a softness in her presence, a warmth that hadn't been there before. Her smiles were more genuine, less guarded, and when we spoke, there was a sense of ease that had never existed between us. We began to talk more often, our conversations flowing effortlessly, moving from lighthearted topics to deeper, more personal ones. The small moments we shared, laughing over coffee, discussing our favorite books, or simply sitting together in comfortable silence, became the foundation of something that was slowly, steadily, becoming more. One evening, after a long conversation about our pasts, I found myself walking her to her door once again. The moment felt significant, not just because it was the end of another conversation, but because it felt like we were on the edge of something more, a step closer to whatever this was between us. As we stood at her doorstep, the silence between us felt different this time. It wasn't awkward or heavy, but soft, filled with a quiet anticipation. She looked up at me, her dark eyes warm and filled with a tenderness that made my heart skip a beat. "I'm glad you came over tonight," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the sincerity in her words was clear. She seemed to be choosing her words carefully, as though she were trying to express something she hadn't fully acknowledged yet. "I am too," I replied, my voice steady, but my emotions running deeper than I let on. I think we've both been waiting for this." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped a little closer, her gaze meeting mine. There was something in her eyes, something unsaid, something that made my chest tighten with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. It was a quiet invitation, an unspoken question hanging in the air between us. In that moment, I realized that whatever had been holding us back, whatever fears or uncertainties we had both been harboring, had faded into the background. We were standing on the precipice of something new, something that neither of us fully understood, but something we were both willing to explore. Nadia smiled softly, a faint blush coloring her cheeks as she took a small step back, almost as if she were giving me the space to decide how we would move forward. "I don't know what's going to happen next," she said, her voice gentle but filled with emotion. "But I want to see where this goes. With you." Her words, though simple, were everything. It was the permission I didn't even know I needed. The acknowledgement that this wasn't just an unexpected connection, it was something worth pursuing, something worth taking a chance on. I smiled back at her, my heart racing, knowing that the journey we were about to embark on was one we were both ready for. "Me too," I said, my voice steady but full of meaning. "I think we're just getting started." The door between us wasn't just a physical barrier now, it was a symbol of the new beginning we were both stepping into. The space between us had closed, and whatever uncertainty had lingered before seemed to dissipate into the night. We didn't need to say anything more. The simple acknowledgement, the shared understanding between us, was enough. As I turned to leave, I felt a quiet thrill inside me. I didn't know where this would go, or how it would unfold, but for the first time in a long time, I felt alive with possibility. I wasn't walking away from her, I was walking towards something that felt more real, more honest, than anything I had ever experienced. Whatever the future held, I knew that Nadia and I had taken the first step together, and that was all that mattered. The new beginning had started.